since we submitted this call for papers, Denim Group got acquired by Coalfire. So I'm now vice president at Coalfire, along with Dan Cornell, if you heard him earlier in the day. So Dan and I were the two of the principals that came over as part of that acquisition. The other thing is, I'm proud to say that Dan and I were, I think, at the first real big OWASP meeting in New York. I want to say 2005-ish, with Mark Curfey and Jeff Williams and all those. So we've been, serial volunteers for OWASP for a decade plus, and friends with people all over the world, including OWASP folks. So we'll get started here, if you don't mind. I'll jump in. And
great, thank you.
So interesting story here is probably about a month or two into the pandemic last year. We're trying to find interesting things to do. We just rolled off of RSA, which was pretty shaky, and the pandemic became real. I think Black Hat had just been canceled. We really didn't know about the future, and we were kind of trying to come up with a cool idea that would be fun for research. And the topic of AppSec champions came up. And what ended up happening was about a 9-month to a year journey to create a huge survey and survey a series of companies and organizations that were doing AppSec champions particularly well. And what we recognized was, although there have been a lot of programs out there, a lot of speaking at OWASP events, nobody had ever really quantified certain common attributes or emerging practices or even best practices. It was largely, there was a little bit here and there, but this was an effort to quantify that across some of the major companies that we know. And so we started this really in earnest in April, May of last year. It took the better part of last year. We finished it this spring, and then Coalfire asked to delay this because they wanted to publish it and make a big deal out of it, which they're doing next month. So you are all getting the first glimpse of these numbers as part of this AppSec Champion survey and the results and kind of recommendations out of it. So there's numbers associated with this, but some certain cool things that you will come to find out are, will help you. This is me again. I won't talk about me, except for I've been in AppSec forever with Dan and others, and really help CISOs and CSOs work with application security programs to build them. And so part of this idea about this survey came out of that we noticed that there was these champion programs everywhere. I think one of the first ones was what Brad Arkin did way back at Adobe with the ninjas. And so we started to see these things come up in different ways. That was the thing that was the genesis of this idea. We'd seen them, they'd been a thing. As a consultant, you get to see lots of client environments, and we saw that these things were everywhere, but nobody had really done any quantitative analysis of it. So that was the thought here. So given the limitation of time, I'm going to try to blast through this. I won't do any justice to it numbers wise, but again, I am publishing the numbers this next month, which is really just, I guess, a week from now. So that's coming up. I'll talk about I'll give you a sense of what we did for the survey itself, the questions, specific questions, the results, and then allow some time to formulate questions in the Slack. So because the way the format is, it won't be interactive, it will be interactive on Slack. I'll try to take the time that I have to go through this in a meaningful way. But the starting point for this was we did what's called a structured research approach. And what does that mean? It means that we knew that there were certain questions that lent themselves to some form of quantitative analysis, numbers. And there's other ones that we wanted to ask questions and have follow-up questions and be able to kind of do a little bit, more interactive research, but at least have data in a somewhat structured way where we can make some sense out of it. So it's not just a narrative. So it looked less like a Survey Monkey form, and it looked a little bit more like a focus group, is what we started to say. And of course, I had to go and ask people for time during the first few months of the pandemic where everyone had an excuse not to do this. So this is all done via Zoom. And it ended up being, like I said, an exercise, a labor of love, but also an exercise in learning a bunch about surveys. My background is I'm a political science as an undergraduate, an MBA type. So I'm used to, doing quantitative research around surveys. That's a little bit of background. I'm an AppSec guy. So our goal was to capture best practices, or probably better said, emerging practices. What are the commonalities across programs? what were the kind of things that jumped out? And again, we started with some hypotheses and based upon anecdote. And the joke is, if you have two anecdotes, you have data, so we kind of came from that and had fairly modest expectations going in. We also wanted to identify some of the common challenges and attributes, around these programs, including the environments. So given this transition from a very much on-prem and kind of web app world to a much more different application world, what were the developers practicing or building, and what were the AppSec people trying to measure? So what we did is we worked with a series of companies, and I had to, target the folks. So anybody that was a program owner, self-identified as an AppSec person, or a security architect that did application security. I didn't really interview, trainers per se, or network folks or CISOs. It was people that were, OWASP, SMEs, OWASP folks, folks that knew and had worked with or started application security champions programs within the organization. So a fairly narrow universe. And we focused on that group. And what I ended up doing is first of all, I had to sell them on participation. And believe it or not, in this day and age, about a third of the companies we talked to said, look, I'm either precluded from doing it, my boss doesn't support it, don't care, we're in a pandemic, can't share information. So, this was the recruitment of people to participate, and the level of effort was actually quite ambitious. We ended up doing 2 or 3 interviews, one to sell them on the idea, secondly, to gather data, validate data. And the value that for them to participate was comparative data that we could say, well, look, this is where what you responded to, and this is where everybody else came in. So there was a little bit of that. Think of SAM or BSAM as examples, but just in this narrow scope of champions. And the result is this report and the data that's coming out next month. So again, labor of love. It took the better part of, now over a year, given the embargo and all that in the pandemic, but it's pretty cool stuff. And I think will also be a launching off point for further analysis and hopefully inspire others. I'd say the broadest goal of this was to up the art of application security, was to provide people in the field with more ammo to push their initiatives, to push AppSec programs, to give a little bit more meat to the bones. So that was really it, so that we could look back and say, this went from a thing that was kind of just happened organically in the field to a more organized and structured thing. Interesting enough, if you talk to the analysts of the world, the Gartners, the Forrester of the world, they don't really focus on this. They focus on technology stuff, technology solutions. As far as process, they do. You bring up AppSec champions and other process stuff, they just kind of don't care. So the whole story behind that. But the net of it is, we again saw this everywhere. So we want to bring this up as and all the AppSec folks that we work with, all the good programs had one. So that's the other thing. Virtually every good program that we work with in the field had a champions program. So we knew there's something there. So, but looking for the candidates ended up being a big effort. I took full-time AppSec staff, and we ended up with 26 companies. It was interesting because we ended up, I think I started with 60 plus. And there's probably about 10 of them who we're going through the process and interviewing them and starting to kind of, for lack of a better term, qualify them. And we realized that really what they had was an AppSec training program, a developer training program. So really what we were talking about here specifically is an AppSec champions program. I think if you're an OWASP person, you understand what this is, but for the lay people, the definition is the use of an AppSec team that has very little managerial control, influencing and driving the AppSec practices and behaviors to a much larger development team that they have very little span of control over. So the concept of lack of managerial control, influence, and then the sheer numbers. What we knew from anecdote was, most AppSec programs had a few folks, the bigger ones have lots of folks, but there was always this number mismatch. So you'd have 5 people and 100 or 1,000 developers. So that was the starting point. So we ended up having and working with 26 companies and back and forth. They represent some of the best programs in some of the better companies. So right off the bat, there's sample bias, I'll fully acknowledge that. But what we didn't want to do is we didn't want to work with companies that had no program, because it put big zeros, or, that they weren't really building software. They were licensing it from the Jack Henrys of the, or the Fiservs of the world. It was really people that built software and, were big enough where they had an AppSec person, or people, so that was kind of a qualifying event. As it turned out, more than 50% of the companies had more than 10,000 folks in them. So this is largely the domain of the larger companies. The smaller companies were probably more like the fintech or the SaaS platform folks. They made, from a headcount standpoint, been 1,000 or 2,000, but they were a SaaS banking platform. So they had a lot of focus on that particular, they had a focus on AppSec. So, but big enterprises, not an SMB or small, medium-sized business play. And so that was the attributes of the companies was important. So the questions themselves, and I think at one point about 20 plus questions, and some of which, most of them followed the hypothesis. Some of them were interesting. Others ones were uninteresting. I'll talk to the results. But the first thing I wanted to determine a little bit of organizational background, because I could infer certain things about the attributes of the program based on the background, and then some trade-offs around sophistication and around practices. So the first thing I looked at is I just asked basic questions. How many devs do you have? How many AppSec, full-time AppSec people do you have, regardless if they're FTEs, like contractors? I don't care. I just want to know how many that are functioning in that role. And there's some discretion there of collection, and we kind of went back and forth on that. And then kind of how many AppSec champions, and the primary inputs for that ended up being uninteresting, but the derivation and the results from comparing those became more interesting. I'll talk about that. The maturity as self-identified along a broad CMMI inspired scale, kind of the environments versus, cloud, how many of them had pipelines. Some of this stuff was to gather information broadly, and then from there, look at trend lines, see if any key findings came out. And as luck would have it, some did. How long did it take these AppSec managers or these security managers to build the programs, and how long had they been in place? What were the attributes of the program? What kind of mandate did they have? Did they have training? How formalized was it? Did they have incentives? How did they recruit champions? All that stuff was part of the questions that came out in the survey. And then two key questions in the end is, did they, kind of a yes, no, did they feel that they were achieving results? And if so, how did they measure ROI? Just two questions. Again, we had a bunch of other draft questions. We threw out some. And as a matter of fact, there's some other ones that we just flat out didn't use for feedback. So right off the bat, I asked, how would you self-identify? How would you characterize your AppSec champion program? Based on a broad scale. And I put some attributes around this that I enumerate in the report, but the vast majority were between maturing and mature. There were a few that were just getting started that said they were emerging. There were a couple that were up at the improving area, no optimizing. So that was an interesting starting point, is, there, and the numbers reflect that they said, hey, we recognize we're moving along. And there was a lot of back and forth dialogue about mature versus maturing and the attributes of that. So there's some discretion here, but the majority of them felt that they had some level of program in place and were moving and improving the program itself. So that's the starting point for analysis. And in the report itself, I kind of break out a little bit of the different attributes of that. So here's one of the things that came out that is initially uninteresting, but then the derivation secondary analysis was interesting. First of all, how many developers do you have? Like on average, 1,600, a number that doesn't mean a whole lot because samples all over the place. How many AppSec staff per, that were focused? Average is 13. And then how many champions? They're all over the place. The more mature ones had more, as you might imagine. And I didn't ask one question I wish I had at the time, which was the coverage between AppSec champions and teams. Like what percentage of teams had a champion? I was like halfway into it, and then I wish I'd asked that. But the key finding was the ratio between AppSec staff and development staff was 1 to 50 to 1 to 100 for the mature programs. They all along that spectrum where the mature to maturing programs were somewhere between 1 to 50 ratio of AppSec people, not the champions, but the actual AppSec staff to developers. And particularly as it related to the financial and fintech companies, right down the middle, 1 to 50 to 1 to 100. I came to find out after the fact that some of these, that reflects numbers that also are parallel to what the folks doing BSIM have come up with too, at least in a couple of instances, which I think is cool. So that is a key finding that kind of jumped out. The average numbers don't mean as much. I looked at other things to infer in sophistication around tool and pipeline usage. All this stuff is enumerated in the report, but in a long story made short is the the majority of them were using pipelines or trending to use pipelines. Almost all of them said we're going down that path. Very few were doing old school dev, as you might imagine. And what percent were hosted in the cloud? 30% said over 90% were. And the interesting thing on both, the lines were a little bit blurred there, distorted by the fact that I had 2 or 3 of the very largest financial services and banks that reported they're all on-prem, which is for the big banks a thing, absent of at least one big bank who is primarily in AWS. A lot of them still are on-prem, so that's interesting. So here's one that jumped out as a big one. So I asked a question about how many people, how many of y'all had SaaS or DaaS or SCA or what, and what I found out is almost all of the mature and virtually all the maturing ones had all 3, SaaS, DaaS, and software composition analysis in place, which there's, I heard Chris Wysopal's speech, talk about at least 2. I also heard Etan's presentation from HCL. So there's a common theme here, multiple tools, correlation, and I think Gartner also says at least use 2 tools. Well, guess what? The most mature ones used all 3 of those as part of their testing program. And I thought that was a cool thing that I didn't anticipate. How long did it take to build the program itself? About 20% said a year. And so a year to a little bit over a year. Some of them were in progress at the point. Now, the one interesting thing that came out from this that I didn't anticipate is a multiple resets. We had clients that had come back and said, hey, we lost a key personnel or leadership change. And as a result, we have a complete, we're starting over. So these numbers are kind of muddled, but think at least a year to a year plus to get these up and running. Now, the other interesting thing is I asked how long they had been in place. And, some of the big financial ones had been in place for over 4 years. That 27% didn't know. What had happened is there's so much turnover in AppSec that I had about a third of the respondents say that they didn't know, they had no idea, or they had to find out. So they had started before they had arrived and were in place already. So one of the secondary findings from this is that these things need leadership, focus and care and feeding, or else, key person leaves or direction changes and they can go away. Here is another thing about organizational background that I found out is the most AppSec programs did not have a strong mandate from, the opposite of the Trusted Computing Initiative from Bill Gates in 2002. As a matter of fact, 2/3 either had no mandate or CISO only. And for the purposes of this presentation, or this report, is if you have the CISO only, that of course you do. I didn't have a single respondent that said they have a CFO, COO, or CEO. The best I had was CTO, where dev lived. So that's an important thing. It's these things are happening organically, as we suspected, lacking the Trusted Computing Initiative leadership, the top-down Bill Gates approach. So here's some interesting ones. In the interest of the time, I'm going to blast through them. Did you have defined roles and standards? 62% said yes. It's a relatively low number. That a lot of the programs use volunteered, but not as many as I thought. There's a healthy combination of volunteered and voluntold, which the assumption here is you're trying to get people that are evangelical, on the dev teams. You may want to have people that are really already bought in. So I do think, I didn't enumerate this in the report, but the real ones that were successful anecdotally were ones that had volunteered, and how do you recruit volunteers? There's a whole discussion track there. The last two results surprised me. They did not have formal training programs. The majority didn't, and they didn't have rewards. So one of the secondary recommendations from this is that you should, when you're starting these programs, have a formalized training and formalized reward program to scale. And rewards don't have to be spending a lot of money. It could be, the rewards like recognition amongst one's peers. That's important too. So the last couple of things, 2 or 3 things that we came up with is, the back and forth. How frequently do you communicate? And, it's constantly. Well, that what happened is we found out, of course, Slack, Teams, like constantly, monthly. But what we also found out that was less obvious is folks identified this. This first came out in the secondary questions was like, yeah, we communicate all the time on Slack. But there's still a role for formalized communications, either a once a month town hall or a once a month newsletter where we recognize people. So that's back and forth. That's great that we have Slack out there, but that doesn't constitute the only communication mechanism. And a formalized mechanism augmenting that is probably pretty good. And of course, everybody, 64% use Slack and Teams. There's probably 2 or 3. That number that probably is underrepresented there. There's probably 2 or 3 that said they were doing the starting point of gamification comparison amongst teams. Looking at some of the training platforms like Secure Code Warrior, they do more of the gamification. That really didn't come up this much. I was surprised it didn't come up more in the survey itself. So, okay, so I'm gonna 2 things. 2 ROI questions I asked: are you achieving your desired outcome? Like broadly, yes or no. So, not all of them did, and I think this bore a lot of follow-up conversations and a lot of head scratching. But I mean, these things just started organically in certain instances, and they started doing it. And there wasn't a whole lot of forethought in many instances of what the outcome looked like. And the same thing is too on the numbers side. We've been able to quantify success. The majority said no or partly. In the case of certain service providers, they said, well, we kind of have in the form of bug reports or mean time to fix numbers, but really we have never asked our clients, or we haven't asked the business units themselves. So that is an interesting observation. I assumed that there would be more of that, and there wasn't. So again, I've got like 5 minutes. So I don't want to blow through the key findings and some recommendations. First of all, there was a strong belief in these programs, regardless of the numbers. I mean, period. There's an evangelical component to this, as AppSec is. I mean, we are still preaching to the vast unwashed masses in certain instances, or we're trying to convince the developers to do something. So that's true. The ROI that we got was the ROI reports were great, but not as much as we had. The anecdotes though were fantastic. As a matter of fact, we got many of them that were in the report where they said, no, we didn't capture those numbers. We don't have anything formalized, but wow, when this guy said this in front of the business unit, that just took off. So there was a lot of anecdote that came out. And that's why the report and the survey was ended up being very valuable, is that the numbers themselves were interesting, but some of the anecdotes and some of the war stories were great too. The majority of programs had a weak managerial mandate, as we anticipated, and that there were certain correlations that do exist between those numbers between dev and AppSec staff and the SaaS stats and SCA and maturity. I thought those were things that jumped out that were pretty interesting. Again, the in-depth surveys going to be in the report, but here's the relevance to you, and this is for from an Intel push is like as a manager, you have to not do one-for-one work. You have to do all these other things and make. Oh, let me go back. And make and influence others and influence group. This is absolutely the case with AppSec champions. Again, a handful of AppSec people trying to influence thousands of developers. Comparative data around surveys is important in general, comparing from your peers using like FSISAC or SAM or BSAM or whatever. Anything that you can do to compare is important. But in order to gain that managerial leverage, you do need to capture and formalize some of the things around training and around ROI numbers. You can't do word of mouth or you just can't do the standard way that, tribal knowledge. You actually have to have things laid out, training materials in order to scale. So in order to get scale and leverage, you have to do that. And finally, we'll know when we're successful when the developers themselves start to view security or whatever you want to call it, resiliency as a component of code quality, where there's no longer this confrontational deal. They've just essentially, like UI, UX, or other aspects and facets of development, it's just a concept of quality that they pull in, and we're coaching and validating and doing whatever. We're not central to that. So that is the end of the Prezzo. I think I hit it right close to the end of the hour. That's my Twitter handle. And if you're interested in the initial report, I'm doing the final edits. It'll be out in October. And when I say October, I don't mean like 4 days from now or next week. I mean like probably October. But I'm interested. The other thing is, if you're interested in this topic, I've got a lot of feedback about building a community of interest around this, and about people that are fired up about AppSec Champions. So please reach out on LinkedIn, on Twitter, or join the Slack afterwards. So with that, I'll hand it all back over to Ann.